Welcome. Thanks for joining us online today. We hope next time we'll get Eric in person, but for today, I think we'll still get a good presentation in the online format. I'm really excited to have Eric with us for this seminar. Eric describes himself as a hydroecologist and or an eco-hydrologist, or both.
Hydroecologist is what I've typically gone with, but yeah, everybody's got their own, well, at least in that field, everybody's got their own opinion on what they prefer.
Okay, which is the prefix and which is the noun?
Right, yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe he'll be able to explain to us which is the prefix and the noun. But he has a kind of a diverse background in limnology and in hydrology, and he has done a lot of work on modeling. So he's always been the person I called the last few years to be like, Eric, I've measured this stuff in the field. Can we do anything with this in a model? And it's like, well, maybe not. So he's been really helpful for me in terms of understanding the different scales at which models and different types of research operate. And this is another story he's going to tell about sort of bridging different worlds between his sort of quantitative hydrological field and a totally different field. So I'll let you
Yeah.
take it from there, Eric. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks so much, Anna, and thanks everyone for showing up virtually. Sorry again, I couldn't be there in person, but definitely honored to be invited to speak to you all and yeah, tell a little bit of a story about this collaboration I've had for close to a decade now with a few different folks here at UW and Indiana University. And it's a little bit of a different presentation that I've given in the past. So it could be a little rough around the edges, just as a heads up. But I'll try and sprinkle in kind of my personal reflections on kind of the collaborative experience and how we've had to kind of deal with kind of doing research with a community that's kind of in motion and kind of going through a lot of different challenges and us not really being kind of this external observer all the time, but really being thrown into the mix of things. So I'm going to start with the people and just introduce the team that I've worked with over this time period. So I've got Rebecca Lave here from Indiana University, Caroline Gottschalk, who is here at UW-Madison. I'll introduce her a little bit more in a second. And then Sydney Wydell and Paige Stork are two former master's students, as well as Emma Lundberg and Ben Sellers. And we've also been engaging with the community in as part of the Driftless area, so Coon Creek and the Kickapoo region, which I'll show a map here in a second. But also wanted to just make a plug here. This presentation is loosely based on a chapter that Caroline and I wrote for this field guide to mixing social and biophysical methods in environmental research that Rebecca invited us to contribute to. And really encourage people to check it out. I think it's a great resource, especially for incoming graduate students that are doing some of these mixed methods. So a little bit about kind of where I'm coming from today and thinking about some of these kind of challenging and tenuous times that we're living in, whether it's related to climate change and water quality challenges, recent flooding, and certainly kind of farmer livelihood challenges, but also thinking a little internally here and around kind of funding cuts to scientific research. And I don't know if you have the same opinion, but I've seen kind of a tendency to maybe retreat back to our own disciplinary silos. And so part of what I'm trying to argue today is to try and push back against that wherever you can. And I think that transformative changes are necessary to face these challenges that we have, but also that inter and transdisciplinary research grounded in places and communities is a really important piece of enacting that change. But as I'll show today, it can come with risks and challenges that need to be thought through. So a little bit more about my background, just again, because this is a little bit of my perspective kind of talk. So I come from kind of the world of environmental engineering, biophysical sciences, hydrology. I've tried to move more into kind of interdisciplinary research. I would say even beginning in my late undergrad. when I started looking at kind of wetlands and fluvial geomorphology and ecology. And that just kind of grew a little bit more and more as I got into my master's at UC Davis, looking more at larger floodplain ecosystems, and then came back to UW-Madison for my PhD in limnology, where kind of zeroed in on more kind of wetland restoration and got more into modeling. So by the time I graduated with my PhD, I was like, oh boy, I'm really an interdisciplinary scientist now. And I quickly realized that there's a whole other world that I haven't even scratched the surface on, and that's more kind of in the social sciences and humanities. So I guess I just continued to be educated in a new position as a research scientist after I graduated, and continue to work on some projects more in kind of the wetland hydroecology area, but an NSF grant to look at watershed scenarios kind of in the Madison region really opened my eyes to a lot of different kind of social science methods. I worked with a few scientists that had worked on scenario analysis and community engagement, as well as viewing social ecological systems and their institutions and how they're governed. And that branched out into new projects. I looked at the water quality impacts of the renewable fuel standard, kind of at a continental scale. And that involved some economists and their modeling tools, and continued working at these larger scales on another NSF grant, and went back to kind of scenario assessment. A USDA grant that Anna and I actually worked on, Grassland 2.0, had a bunch of interdisciplinary work, including some sociologists. And so I was kind of slowly building a little bit more comfort in branching outside of the biophysical sciences. But today I'm going to speak more to this last group related to what we've been working on, kind of the Kickapoo Basin and part of the Driftless area. And it started with research on riparian and stream restoration, and has branched out into kind of more flood resilience topics. And so that's the team that I'll be talking about today, kind of that last bullet point. But just a little bit more on kind of where my teammates are coming from a disciplinary perspective. And so Caroline in the middle here likes to call herself a fluvial rhetorician, which I'm not sure how many others there are out there, but she has this kind of unique combination of an interest, and she actually got a freshwater science degree from UW-Madison while she was faculty, but also came from this training in rhetoric. And for those not familiar with rhetoric or rhetorical sciences, so rhetoric is really the capacity of language to persuade audiences, connect individuals, and affect the biophysical world. And so she kind of uses that disciplinary frame to look at stream management issues and conflicts. And Caroline and I met almost a decade ago at a workshop related to scenario analysis. And she then, a few years later, caught wind of an ad to teach at UW-Madison. And then she came a few years later, luckily, and we started this collaboration ever since. A little bit later, we added Rebecca Lave, who has this wonderful background in geography. And geography is kind of interesting because it's kind of inherently interdisciplinary. But she kind of brings this critical physical geography lens to our research. And again, if you're not familiar with that, it's bringing together social and biophysical sciences with the aim of supporting kind of social ecological transformation, and really paying attention to kind of power relations and the use of science in a lot of these kind of water and stream conflicts. So I'm really kind of grateful to be a part of this team, all kind of looking at streams in different ways. And some of the methods, so I'll touch on some of these as we go along in the story, but this is kind of the list of the ones that we use the most. And starting out with the ones that I'm most familiar with and was trained in during my graduate studies. So field observations, right, in both kind of the stream geomorphic way and hydrologic field observations and doing data analysis on those observations. And then I also do a lot of biophysical modeling, whether that's hydrologic or hydraulic, water quality modeling I do a bit of, but not for this project specifically. And then stream temperature is another model I tend to employ. The other ones are coming more from Caroline and Rebecca's expertise, and I'm slowly kind of learning these over the years that we've collaborated. And so this includes interviews, and we tend to use what are called semi-structured interviews. So we kind of have a rough idea of the topics and questions we'll go over, but open to the conversation kind of moving organically. And then those are transcribed, they're analyzed, they're coded using different software. And we're really interested in trying to analyze the perspectives of who we're talking with on complex issues. Caroline also uses oral histories, which is kind of coming more from the humanities, and you're documenting community stories, kind of building relationships with the community that you're engaged with, and really speaking to the future to kind of create a collective imagination amongst this community. And then finally, we also really dig into kind of the history of these places and some of the policy issues. And so that requires a lot of document analysis and archival analysis. And I should note that, once you branch into these social science methods, you do need to go through kind of an institutional review board approval process, which was something that was new to me when I started collaborating with Caroline and Rebecca. So I tried to come up with my perspective on the principles, I guess, roughly that we use as in this collaboration. And I think starting out with really being humble and respectful of our different backgrounds and disciplines. And I think sometimes I've heard of cases where people collaborate and their view of the world and how they acquire knowledge, they can sometimes dominate the conversation. And certainly that has happened from the biophysical side of things. And so I try to be reflective of those experiences and try to be a little bit more humble and also curious and really digging into, okay, how do you employ your discipline? What kind of methods do you use? And how can we really peel back the layers of this complex problem and be open to using new methods? And that kind of includes risk taking where appropriate, try to get out of our comfort zone sometime. And we're really also interested in caring for each other and the community that we're working with, and recognizing that it is a place and it has a history. And we try not to kind of do our own thing and kind of add it together. It really is trying to be a synthetic contribution, tying things together and mixing our methods together. And then the last few, being responsive to community needs and just having fun. Like it's a lot of fun to learn these new methods, and we enjoy working together, and we try not to take ourselves too seriously. So a few terms and definitions, just as part of this mixed methods conversation. So there are disciplines and there are epistemologies, and that's certainly a term that I had not known anything about throughout my graduate training, which is still confusing now thinking back on it. I really do think it's important to train graduate students in a little bit of the philosophy of science. And it's not just about how there are different disciplines, but going deeper and recognizing like how does a discipline or a researcher gain knowledge and make knowledge claims about the system that they're studying. Like it is very different how some disciplines approach a problem, and there's no kind of right or wrong way to do it. They're just inherently different. So Caroline studies rivers in a different way than I do, really kind of focusing on how people used arguments. Whereas I'm going to go out there and focus on water and sediment and how it flows through a watershed and a river network. So again, really just different ways of coming at it. And then there are different kind of ways to mix these disciplines or these epistemologies together, and you kind of go a little bit in order here in terms of kind of the intensity of that mixing. So the first is called, and I recognize that there's not one set definition for each of these terms, but cross-disciplinary usually means when one discipline kind of borrows a method from another. An example could be like a geomorphologist borrowing photogrammetry from engineering surveying to create a digital elevation model from a drone, for instance, which I'm guessing people are familiar with. But then multidisciplinary, so that's bringing in different disciplines and likely, different people within those disciplines together on a project, but not really kind of mixing. It might be kind of in sequence where you might have an economist added to a water quality project to determine a shore owner's willingness to pay for lake restoration, for instance, just as an example. And so I kind of think of that as like a gathering of disciplinary silos. Then interdisciplinary is where you do start to mix these different methods and ways of viewing the research. And you're comparing, you're contrasting different framings and really searching for kind of synthetic contributions. And so an example of that is, if you want a deep understanding of a watershed's potential for improving water quality, it really requires kind of geomorphology, history, social science, hydrology. This is where we can start to really shine a light on kind of foundational context and some of these complexities involved in finding solutions. Then finally, transdisciplinary is, again, one of these terms that doesn't have a single definition, but for the most part, it's kind of opening this research process to those that are actually impacted by the research or the community, and incorporating their knowledge into the research design. An example of this could be a participatory watershed modeling project, kind of having the community start with the underlying design of the model, kind of co-designed together, along with any scenarios that are run through that model. And I will say, we are not kind of purely any one of these. And I would say we're kind of a mix of the last three, and it really depends on at what point in the project we are. And I also will say it's really difficult to do transdisciplinary research all the time. Like, just logistically, it's challenging to kind of work with a community, even like before you develop a proposal, and how do you gain that trust without having a little bit of funding to kind of start to work in a community. So just recognizing that these are hard to do sometimes. Okay, so I'm going to go real quickly, just for those that are unfamiliar with the Driftless area, give as quick of a background as I can on kind of the history of how we got to this point today, and kind of where we're taking the research to look at some of these issues related to flooding. So the Driftless area escaped glaciation. It's this ancient dissected landscape. It's kind of this two-leveled system where we have broad uplands, relatively flat, very steep hill slopes, and then flat valleys. And it was a mix of kind of prairie, oak savanna, and forest throughout the Holocene, and it kind of shifted through different changes in climate. It's blanketed by this silty loess soil, so it's highly erodible. Keep that in mind. There's abundant kind of cold water trout streams. It's also important to recognize this is the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk and several other tribes, and they are still persisting in this land today and kind of co-managing some of these places that we'll be talking about. And it's a diverse agricultural system today, and it looks a lot different than other parts of the Midwest. And just to, again, recognizing that this land is the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk. There's a lot of different examples of some innovative partnerships happening in kind of the Kickapoo watershed. I won't be able to highlight today, but keep it in mind that these things are happening. Just to zoom in a little bit more to the specific watersheds I'll be talking about today are the Coon Creek and the West Fork Kickapoo. So kind of in the central part of the Driftless area. So prior to Euro-American settlement, there was, again, this mosaic of prairie, oak savanna, and forest. Certainly the Ho-Chunk shaped the landscape with agriculture and hunting and fire. And the soils were rich in organic matter, and we think, they would have a high infiltration capacity as a result. But following kind of the violent and forced and ultimately unsuccessful removal of the Ho-Chunk, the land was largely converted to cropland and pasture. Wheat production kind of dominated early on, and dairy kind of came a little bit later into the scene, which meant corn, hay, and pasture. And this was done even on some steep slopes, and that's where the land kind of started to unravel with a loss of soil organic matter and a decrease in infiltration capacity. So overland flow increased, erosion increased dramatically, and I'm sure many of you have seen a lot of historic pictures from this era showing a lot of gully erosion, a lot of flooding, and a lot of floodplain sedimentation. And then in the 1930s, this is where kind of this rise of conservation came in and really had a lot of its start in the Coon Creek watershed in the 1930s. And it was a collaborative effort between federal and state conservation scientists and local, innovative, risk-tolerant farmers. And they implemented together a lot of changes from converting the hill slopes to forest, stabilizing gullies, putting more perennials on some of these more susceptible slopes. Contour strips is certainly one of the iconic features that you see in the Driftless area even today. And it was a massive effort, a lot of labor on the ground, and again, a lot of collaboration across kind of the farming community and different scientists and conservationists, along with the Civilian Conservation Corps. And recognizing that this took a lot of federal and state government support to enact these changes. And a few more pictures to kind of illustrate some of the things that were going on at that time. So terraces and tree planting. And again, that kind of iconic conservation practice, the contour strip cropping, you can kind of see it propagating out from kind of the Coon Creek Basin through the different decades here across the Driftless area. So this was kind of a story of kind of collaborative redemption in my mind. And it's a story that's really central to the region's identity. And it comes up like time after time, even in interviews with people living there today, with kind of long histories in the region. So erosion declines, the large floods decrease, and we actually now have data to show some of those changes through time at some of the USGS gauges. More infiltration and groundwater recharge also led to more base flow for trout streams, which really rejuvenated those stream ecosystems. And it's a huge part of the economics in that region today. But the legacy of past erosion kind of remains. And, when Caroline and I started to work together, we were really focused on this question of restoring streams and floodplains, and just recognizing that it's extra challenging because of this kind of post-settlement alluvial material that came down from the uplands kind of during that late 19th, early 20th century time period. So a little bit on that kind of first thread of research that Caroline and I started working on around 2017, 2018. And we were very fascinated in this ongoing debate around what's better in the riparian zone in the Driftless area, grass or trees. And it does get heated at times. It's gotten a little better over the years, but we, employed a couple of different methods from our collective kind of experiences. First, just kind of reviewing the literature, but also digging in at a specific site that we were monitoring that was kind of going through this transformation from a tree dominant to grass dominant. And I had a graduate student do some stream temperature modeling because that was a key component here. People were worried about the removal of shade leading to higher stream temperatures, so we wanted to look at that. But then Caroline, was really interested in the arguments that people were using, kind of pro grass or pro trees. So we did a bunch of interviews with stream managers and practitioners. And we even did another method called the Q method, which is a little bit of a mix of quantitative and qualitative, kind of having people sort statements by agreement and kind of clustering different perspectives together. So just to kind of summarize all of that, there are conflicts that exist amongst people in these management discussions around stabilizing stream banks, stream temperature, and kind of species-specific habitat creation. And brown trout here is the big one. But we also found that shading largely leads to cooler conditions, even if the channel is wider as a consequence of kind of going more towards trees. But management decisions are just inherently dependent on human values and priorities. And so how much is too much stream warming is really a question that science is not going to be able to answer, or how much is too much bank erosion, knowing that you have this post-settlement alluvial material kind of still working its way through the system. So we kind of wanted to step back and say, people are trying to use science to settle this question, but it's just not possible, right? We have different human values and priorities that need to be debated, and people need to make arguments from those kind of perspectives rather than relying on the science to kind of obfuscate, I guess, those arguments sometimes. So that we were doing that, and then 2018 hit, a flood of record. And if you were kind of in the area, I'm sure you heard about it. A lot of gauges hit their record, and it was a really devastating event kind of in late August, early September. Some areas receiving up to 12 inches of rain in close to 12 hours. So just a really devastating event. So we kind of go back to this history real quick to kind of put this flooding into context. And again, if we started with this hypothetical watershed receiving like a 24-hour 5-inch rain event, we would think kind of pre-European American settlement, maybe that resulting flood would be down here. But then after that conversion to cropland and pasture, that theoretical flood would have, gotten much, much bigger. And when we had that kind of collaborative redemption part of the story, the adoption of soil conservation, we brought those floods back down, not quite to where they were pre-Euro-American settlement, but dramatically declined. So what's happening now with this new round of flooding? That's kind of the question. And we can see this decline with the gauge data that I mentioned before. It's quite clear, even though 78 was a big year, this decline was happening, and we kind of felt like we turned the corner with this land conservation boom. And I would also argue, and I'll get into this a little bit later with one strand of the research, but really, I think the hill slopes are a key part of this, and reducing the cropping and grazing or intensive grazing on the hill slopes made a big difference. And I'm just going to zoom in on this real quick for one slide and just show you a cross section of kind of the conceptual model that we're working with here. That there's runoff that's generated on the ridge top, and a lot of that runoff ends up infiltrating on the hill slope if it is given that opportunity to slow down just a little bit because it has this kind of coarse soil and fractured bedrock underneath it. So it's steep, so it's not automatic that this happens. And certainly when gullies start forming on that steep landscape, it can kind of short circuit this potential. So those two things combined, I think, really made it a sensitive area of the landscape where management change could have a profound impact on that kind of rainfall runoff relationship. So getting back to the history, the decline in flooding resulting from these conservation changes, it wasn't immediate. And it's one thing for it to happen over many decades, like the changes on the ground to conservation practices. But it's another to kind of realize the impact because you're not seeing the same rainfall every year, right? So prior to these changes being realized or documented, the community pushed for other measures to be implemented to help with flooding. And in this case, like many other watersheds across the country at the time, they were interested in dams. And in this case, they were small dams. And they started all the way back in the 30s with very small kind of upland dams that you still see kind of scattered throughout the region. But these were more designed for erosion control. It wasn't until the 1940s and 50s that the USDA started getting in on kind of the small dam construction boom. And if you're familiar, this is the PL 566 program. And they were building one PL 566 dam per day during the peak. I mean, just a huge boom in construction. And the place where it was happening the most in Wisconsin was actually in these two watersheds, the Kickapoo, or West Fork Kickapoo and the Coon Creek. And they were meant to complement upland soil conservation practices. But really the community was still clamoring for some kind of federal intervention to help with flooding. And this was what was available. So there were 14 constructed in the Coon Creek watershed, 9 in the West Fork Kickapoo, and they had about a 50-year design life. And a little bit later on, it was estimated that these dams probably decreased the 100-year flood by around 15%. But compare that with an estimated 50% decrease from the upland practices. So it kind of just gave a little bit more of a flood reduction benefit than what had been provided by those conservation practices. All right, so we'll go back to this kind of historical flood context. Here we are kind of in the early 2000s, and again, we've turned a corner, and it seems like these floods have come down quite a bit. But then something changed, and 2007 was a big flood year, 2008 was a big flood year, and then eventually that flood of record in 2018 happened. And it really was a big change. And we think it was largely driven primarily by a warming climate with increasing frequency of heavy rainfall. Again, not a huge surprise to this audience, I'm guessing. But also, it's hard to disentangle some backsliding in land management being a driver. So at this same period of time, we started to see more dairy farms being lost from the landscape due to consolidation. And along with those dairy farms, you're losing contour strips. Some marginal land was also going back into cropland, maybe on some of the steeper hill slopes. And there's been some analysis on that front. So the 2018 flood, again, was just devastating for this region. It was a miracle that nobody lost their life. But there were flood control structures, those PL 566 dams, several of them failed, and they failed catastrophically. It was 3 in the Coon Creek Basin and 2 in the West Fork, Kickapoo. So what does the watershed community do now? There was obviously a state of emergency declared, and the community is just grappling. Well, somebody asking a question, or are they just not muted?
Just check your mute, please. Thank you.
Okay. So the Coon Valley residents, they're looking for solutions and reeling from this devastating flood. And the question for us is, we're involved in this stream restoration and stream research at the time. How are we going to respond to this? And certainly the reaches that we were looking at and restoration practices in general are impacted by flooding, but a broader focus kind of on flood resilience was what we needed to kind of shift towards, we thought. And so the community and the government and researchers like us responded after this flooding in a couple of different ways. And I'm going to kind of go through, again, a little timeline to illustrate this story. So right after the floods in the fall of 2018, the NRCS comes back into the watershed, over 50 years later, this small watershed dam program. So they come in and they do an engineering study on the dam failures. They identify weaknesses in the sandstone foundation. Remember that cross section I showed you where that fractured bedrock can lead to high infiltration rates? Well, it can also be not great for dam building. And another important thing that happened relatively quickly was another project that Caroline started called the Stories from the Flood. And this was in collaboration with the Driftless Writing Center. And I really didn't play a role at all on this project, but it is a really important piece of this larger kind of research picture. And so these were oral histories collected from over 100 participants. It's really incredibly rich archive of perspectives from locals impacted by the recent floods, but also talking about historic floods and the relationship between land and people and climate. And it really informed kind of our research going forward. In the summer of 2019, I was leading the UW-Madison Water Resources Management practicum, and I decided that this would be a perfect opportunity to have about 6 master students focus directly on this watershed and take kind of this interdisciplinary approach. And I asked Caroline if she would help and a few others and try and document some of the recent land changes, do some infiltration tests, but also do some interviews to kind of complement the Stories from the Flood project and look at some of the flood response from the different kind of government institutions that were involved. In the fall of 2019, this is when the NRCS got some funding to do a more kind of rigorous watershed project plan and environmental impact statement. They got $1.7 million from Congress to do this, and they contracted with a consulting firm to do kind of an economic cost benefit analysis to answer this question, do we rebuild the dams? And it was a very kind of narrowly focused question into, is it in the federal government's interest to rebuild these dams? And so it was supposed to end in December of 2021. It didn't actually end until August 2024, which is part of the story here. A long, drawn-out process. But for our purposes, another interesting aspect is, as part of that cost-benefit analysis, it required the development of watershed, hydrologic, and hydraulic models to kind of determine the impacts of different alternatives as part of this planning process. And ultimately, they would come up with some preferred alternative. So we caught wind of that development. We knew that there were going to be a lot of resources being brought from that project to the watershed, and Caroline and I decided to go after an NSF grant, and we asked Rebecca Lave to join us as part of this coupled natural human systems program at NSF, which is really it's no longer a program at NSF, but is really dedicated to kind of this interdisciplinary collaboration. And so as required in those types of proposals, you needed to have some kind of diagram like this in the bottom right. But essentially what we're trying to do is look at these connections between humans, land, climate, and water, and kind of connect with the previous work we were doing on stream restoration, and really try and help the community navigate what to do after this devastating flood event. And we would deploy some of the same methods that we had used before, kind of continuing some of those geomorphic surveys, interviews, but really digging in more to the hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, and really trying to develop some scenarios with the community on how to move forward, and hopefully going to do some participatory workshops as part of that modeling. At least that was the initial idea, and I will tell you how it changed a little bit as we went through the process. Another aspect of the project is, in hindsight, maybe a little lofty, but we were trying to integrate a whole bunch of different projects that were happening in that region at the time. So you had the plan from the NRCS, the EIS. We had the water resources management practicum students, the stories from the flood. But then we also had another project that I was actually working on called Grassland 2.0. This is what Anna was working on as well. And we were working with the Kickapoo region and the community on kind of more agroecosystem issues and improving water quality. And so this was definitely going to fit into that conversation as well, and we wanted to be able to connect to it. So, a little bit more about the models. So for the hydrologists, I'm sure you're familiar, but if you're not, so the hydraulic model or hydrologic model is your kind of rainfall runoff response model. They're using HMS. It's a fairly kind of standard off-the-shelf model that gets used a lot. And then the hydraulic model is called RAS, also from the Hydrologic Engineering Center at the Army Corps. But really what it's trying to do is just take that rainfall input, generate a runoff response, and then how is that response kind of reflected along the stream network in terms of kind of inundation area and water surface elevation. And then they have an economist as part of that project to kind of make the cost benefit analysis associated with kind of the benefits with reducing flood and the damages associated with reducing kind of flood extent. So one of the graduate students that I advised was Paige Stork. And she was coming from kind of this engineering background, and she was really interested in these models and how they were potentially going to be used in the community. And she wanted to explore kind of these different land management change scenarios and be responsive to kind of community inputs. And so she developed this tool to kind of automate the process of running these models on kind of an interface for communities to use. And also kind of interested in if there's an opportunity to target different practices across the watershed for kind of more of an impact. But the challenge here is that this kind of explicitly connected us as researchers to the NRCS Plan EIS team, which in the beginning was great because we would have access to the models. But as this project unfolded, it really required us to do some mediating between the community and this federal agency that was kind of under increasing levels of scrutiny from the community. And that's where things get a little hairy. So in summer 2021, the NRCS begins to communicate that the breached dams or the failed dams are not going to be repaired, likely, once everything is said and done from this economic cost-benefit analysis. And they also estimated that additional conservation practices on existing cropland would not provide much of a flood benefit. So these two pieces in combination really roiled the community up, and I think for very understandable reasons once you reflect back on this long history of land conservation. And they felt kind of a sense of betrayal that the NRCS was not going to be repairing these dams and basically saying, sorry, we're kind of exiting this watershed and you guys are going to have to kind of do it on your own. But the community did still want to have the Plan EIS and the modeling kind of explore more aggressive land change scenarios, not just on existing cropland, but really dialing up how much could potentially be done on a land management standpoint to reduce flood benefit or reduce flood impacts. At about the same time, again, there was this community concern that the Plan EIS was not reflecting people's what they wanted done. And so the Coon Creek Community Watershed Coalition was formed, and they are still going today strong, trying to kind of revamp that spirit of the 1930s around experimentation and collaboration to focus on flood reduction today. So in fall 2021, the kind of communication to the community after some slow drips was not only were the repaired or the failed dams not going to get repaired, but all of the dams in the watersheds were not going to be or were going to be decommissioned. So basically just taking them all out of the flood management picture. And this was a real shock to the community. And you can understand the NRCS perspective in terms of these structures being a liability now after some of the engineering failure analysis. But it really led to declining trust and rising anger in the community. And we were also finding kind of some limitations of this kind of standard off-the-shelf hydrologic model and not representing some of these kind of nuanced processes that seem to be really important in the driftless area, like this idea of hill slope infiltration. So it was just the modeling process was kind of losing some credibility in the community. So we decided to kind of scale down the expectations on this decision support tool that Paige was working on. At the time, again, we had this Grassland 2.0 project that was already developing some decision support tools around how different land transformation scenarios could impact biophysical outcomes like runoff, soil loss, phosphorus loss, and nitrate leaching. So we felt that there was at least some tool available for the community to kind of work with and kind of generate some of these scenarios at the watershed scale. And we just decided that the models just weren't quite ready for what we needed. And we needed to kind of improve our modeling capacity. The other student on the project, Sydney, so she had a little bit more of a challenge trying to zoom in on a specific kind of thesis topic because we gave her a lot of flexibility as part of the NSF grant. But now that this kind of Plan EIS process was leading to kind of less trust, kind of a lack of credibility, she really took an interest in kind of zooming out and seeing how this Plan EIS process fit into a long history in the region of humans managing land and water dynamics and disturbance, and kind of helping people to explore resilient paths forward for kind of living with this dynamic watershed. And so I don't have enough time to kind of go into this really great paper that's coming out soon that she led. But she was kind of relying on some of these methods that I spoke about earlier, kind of digging through some archival analysis and interviewing some of the local stream and watershed managers. So the Plan EIS was completed in August 2024. Again, this was kind of communicated earlier by the NRCS, but now it's in writing. The high cost of rebuilding the dams, along with kind of minimal development downstream, just led to a very low benefit to cost ratio. And in addition, there were these safety concerns around the remaining dams. And so their preferred alternative was to decommission not only the breached dams, but all remaining PL 566 dams. So that's 23 in these two watersheds with only one dam. So 22 decommissioned, one dam remaining that will be rebuilt depending on funding, which had a recreational value associated with a lake. The rest of these dams were dry detention dams. So the decommissioning is going to be pretty minimal, just constructing a notch in all of the non-breach dams that would allow kind of a 100-year flood to pass through. Initially, they said all the costs for decommissioning would be covered by federal sources, but now that is up in the air due to kind of federal budget processes in the last year or so. So there was a lot of challenges along the way that kind of impacted our research, and we kind of had to be flexible and a little nimble. But it really comes down to what I would say is kind of a lack of understanding of the region's history of land conservation. You know, these were consultants brought in from outside the region that, you know, had limited time to kind of engage and interact and really understand the context of this watershed. And they also had to kind of change the purpose of the Plan EIS from its original kind of planning to prevent or reduce flood damages to more of a kind of watershed management purpose, which included kind of removing dams because they were too risky. The community has really asked the NRCS for more guidance on upland practices, but they've haven't gotten a bunch or much of a response, and it's more of a, well, you have to kind of work with existing USDA programs, whether that's EQIP or, you know, the whole alphabet soup of available programs, which is not entirely satisfying, right, to a community that's kind of reeling in the face of these dam failures and the decommissioning of the remaining ones. And then from my standpoint and kind of the hydrologic research standpoint, like there really are some fundamental limitations to these models that just made me really unsure of how to even use them in a decision-making process, and this need to kind of step back and say, we just can't really gain a ton from using these at the moment. And that's kind of led to kind of this last few slides here on kind of where we are now. And Rebecca and I are kind of continuing to look at how can we improve this process of NRCS watershed planning, because certainly this isn't going to be the last time a community like this has to go through this, right? So how can models and scenario development activities better capture kind of the desired community futures? And one example here is this idea of natural flood management, where you have you know, innovative kind of distributed practices across a watershed that's just really hard to represent in some of these off-the-shelf models. And then I'm also kind of doing some more field experimentation, actually going back to a 60-year-old research site just southeast of La Crosse at the Cooley Experimental Forest, and looking at some diversion berms kind of moving water into some infiltration structures on the hill slope. And it's a cool project. I'm really excited to kind of get these flumes installed, hopefully in the next few weeks, and maybe shed some light on a promising new practice that I feel like is fairly low cost and that homeowner or that landowners and perhaps the NRCS would be interested in supporting through public resources. So I realize I'm running over a little time here, but just the last slide on kind of final reflections. I really, again, would argue that inter and transdisciplinary research is essential right now. I encourage people to find collaborators outside of biophysical research, not just economics. I think no, I don't want to badmouth anybody in economics. I've had good collaborations in the past. It's just sometimes a little bit too easy to only reach out to economic researchers because it's kind of nice to interact with their models sometimes. Like we're all living in a model world and it makes those interactions a little easier. But there's a whole world of other disciplines out there that can really shine an important light and lens on some of these difficult and complex topics. So be careful, but I would avoid politically contentious topics. I'm putting that in quotes because it's really about how we use government resources and public dollars. Like that should be a topic of scholarly research across these different disciplines. And so just because it has kind of a contentious air to it, doesn't mean it shouldn't be something that you should go after from like a research standpoint. And community engaged research is really fun. I think water is kind of this ultimate integrator and is really a well-suited subject for this kind of interdisciplinary approach. And finally, it just needs more research or more support to do this research, right? Specific funding, whether it's at NSF or internal university resources. I know that there are plenty of examples of places that emphasize the need for this type of research, but I think we could use so much more. There are a lot of programs at NSF that have kind of been closed down in this space in the recent years. And if you have an opportunity to advocate for more of those type of programs, I would certainly welcome that. And then finally, that mixed methods book, if you're interested, let me know. I can send you a link. It's free and online. So I will leave it there. And sorry, Anna, for taking a little bit longer.
No worries. We have a few minutes for questions, and I think I did put the link to the book in the chat, Eric, unless I
Great.
got it wrong, but it looked right to me. Any
Yeah, I'm
questions
sure it
for
is. Thank
Eric? You
you.
can unmute or type it in the chat. Guess I have one if we're waiting for people, which is
Sure.
about this question of whether you trusted the model employed by the other scientists. Like, do you think it's valuable for two scientists to have a debate like that kind of in public in front of the community? Or do you wish you'd gotten your ducks in a row with the door closed and then come out and presented something you could both sort of agree on or compromise on?
Right. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it wasn't really in these public meetings that we would have kind of technical arguments about kind of the limitations of these models. It was more kind of happening behind the scenes. And the challenge is that I don't really have a good alternative to kind of offer in terms of a model that adequately represents some of these management practices that folks on the ground are interested in deploying. And so I think it just needs more work in kind of the model development side of things. And you can always move forward and make decisions based on models that aren't perfect. But I think in this case, it was just that infiltration on the hill slope was such an important issue that just was not captured at all by these coarser models. So I was very hesitant to kind of close down any discussion that suggested that land management was ineffective at reducing floods, because that was kind of the direction things were headed.
Right, just completely disempower the managers, yeah.
Right.
There's this question from a student. How would you suggest pushing research more into epistemology from a student perspective and generally understanding this concept more when coursework doesn't push us towards that? This idea of what is your method of knowledge acquisition, your way of understanding?
Yeah, well, I mean, not to sound like a somebody that's trying to push our free book, but I think that's a great. It's really designed for kind of that graduate student audience. It's really approachable. The first few chapters kind of give a broader overview of the importance of kind of this of being humble when working with different disciplines and these different epistemologies. But then it actually goes through later on in the book and gives kind of the ingredients of what they call the research recipes. And so you can learn about those different methods in pretty short chapters. So they're very like digestible. So I think it's a great place to start. And certainly if you wanted to reach out to other folks on campus that do work on similar topics, but from a different discipline, like feel free to approach them. People are usually pretty excited to talk about the research. Um, yeah,
That's universal across disciplines, hopefully.
totally. Yeah. And at University of Minnesota, it's another big campus. There's bound to be people doing a whole bunch of cool things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm gonna wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Eric, for spending time
Yeah,
with us. I
absolutely.
know your email is out there on the internet if anybody needs to get in touch with you. But yeah, thanks everybody for coming.
Sounds good. Thanks all.